Hello and welcome to Now and Zen. Today's guest is Hunter Ewen. Yes, and we are so excited to have him on and talk about all his cool pieces that use visuals and noise and microtonality. We're really glad to have you on the show, Hunter. Thanks for being on with us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, one thing that I would really like to talk about right away is Venom consumption and saturation. I don't know. How did you make that piece? What was your workflow like?
Yeah, so the original conception was that this was supposed to be kind of my attempt at a political piece, and normally that's not something that I do, but I was feeling, I guess, up for the challenge. So I wanted to treat it kind of like a big data analytics problem rather than a more traditional composition. So the goal was to eventually find some knob or some set of buttons or knobs that I could twist in some kind of creative way to make interesting sounds happen. But with that one, the first part of the piece was assembling this giant corpus of sounds, and each sound is between half a second and 2 seconds long, and it's usually from some popular or populist idiom. Most of them I made myself, and some were kind of available on free libraries, things like that. So I assembled about 33,000 of them.
Oh my God.
Together, and then tagged, cataloged, taxonomized, tried to figure out some meaningful way of playing with them so that I could ask for a certain kind of sound rather than the actual individual sound that I wanted. And I had some were detuned, some were retuned, and I had some kind of control over playback speed, over kind of overall length, and any kind of pitch shifting that I wanted to do. So all that happened in Max. And then I came up with some kind of algorithm where I could paint in different colors into a score. Essentially, I was just working in Photoshop, but I would feed the Photoshop file into Max and then parse out what color is happening at what area. And then I had assigned say different colors to mean different kinds of sound. So the low sort of bloopy, trip-hoppy kind of bass thing is dark purple, and this green is going to be some combination of the glittery sound and this repetitive thing. And so then by painting in different areas, different colors, I was able to establish a kind of iterative mechanism where I could try something out, listen to it. Oh, that's not quite right, but maybe if this is a little bit less purple, or if there's a little blob here of gold, or I put a little star here, or maneuver the graphics around in some kind of different way. As Max read through it and parsed it and turned it into a rendered audio file, I was at least able to make some kind of creative decisions around when I wanted things to repeat, when I wanted them to drift out of a kind of centricity, when I wanted them to come back into a kind of key or scale at the very least. And then every decision was routed through a server in Russia, because I thought, I guess programmatically, or in like the narrative sense, it might have been meaningful for me right after the election to try to route my data through Russian servers. So you can't hear that in the music, but I thought it was an interesting twist.
Yeah, it's a cool little twist. I wondered what you meant by that, because when I first heard this track, I thought, well, like, oh, this sounds like that situation where like you play a bunch of tracks at the same time, and you had listed like the number, I think like 33,000. And I was like, 33,000 tracks? How did he regulate the volume for all that? But then, as the piece went on, I kind of realized, oh, this isn't just the tracks running. There's like serious manipulation happening with how all of this is working together.
So I think the eventual goal was to try to capture that feeling that we all had 3 years ago, I guess right after the election. And there was this sort of sense of so much is happening, and I can't really deal with any of it. Like it's just news onslaught and media onslaught and kind of looking at Facebook was exploding and my Twitter feed was going bananas, and I don't usually use those as like meaningful places to draw creative inspiration, but in this case it was just such an all-consuming thing and I couldn't really escape it, and I started to become really interested in that idea of inescapability. And then also that moment after you become oversaturated and you're like, 4 months into this campaign cycle and you're just done and you don't know what to do, but the stuff keeps coming and the conversations keep happening. And I kind of find myself getting numb a little bit.
Yeah.
That it's sort of like the news was happening at me, but I wasn't really an active consumer in it anymore. And I think with Venom, the goal was to try to foster that same feeling musically. So using the kind of musical onslaught as a metaphor for the sort of for the political onslaught that was happening in all of our lives at the time, and I guess still is on some level.
I love how that piece has its own little like narrative about saturation within it. Like if you were to run a piece that had like random changing tempos or something, or run a bunch of tracks with random changing tempos, it would sound different than what you made. I feel like there's sort of an intentionality to it, but it still doesn't lock into any particular tempo. Right,
and it sort of comes down to the idea of different kinds of randomness, right? Maybe some types are more curatorial and some types are true random, and there's a very different aesthetic that comes out if you're, say, listening to, I don't know, like John Cage, Atlas Eclipticalis, which is using star patterns to generate pitches and timings. And there's a real beauty behind that because you get these sort of fun clusters and you get really interesting sounds that you wouldn't think of if you were just a regular human being trying to make things random, or even worse, trying to make things almost but not quite random. So that's certainly one way to do it. I think this one, I wanted it to feel a little bit more pointed. And that was kind of the first time I had explored that. But the sense that it's random to the listener, but not necessarily random to the creator. So that there's a kind of order and logic behind it, but in the way that you might experience listening to Xenakis, a new piece that you hadn't heard before, you're not really going to pick up on what the mechanism is of composition. And I sort of wanted to take that to the nth degree, this idea that there's something that's being hidden from you, whatever the underlying mechanism is. You can feel it, that there's some rigidity or some stability or some sense of order, but you don't know exactly how it works and you don't know what it is. And then that feeling in itself is kind of unsettling and nerve-wracking and a source of stress, in the same way that if you zoom in one fractal level, you feel that same kind of stress, ideally when you hear all the individual sounds just played back to back to back.
Yeah. And so when you used visuals to order this piece to kind of create that mechanism, of course, something that nobody would guess, did you do that because it was helpful to organize the information that way?
Yeah, I found like I wanted to have some kind of knob or button or setting or something that I could adjust to make creative decisions. We talked about John Cage just a second ago, and I really am a big fan of his, and I love this idea of setting something up and just letting it spin out, setting the initial conditions and then letting the piece of music emerge from that.
Yeah.
I feel like that for me, the natural next step in that kind of progression of experimentation is to set up initial conditions and then figure out some way to generate an iterative cycle. So I want to be able to turn something or tune something or adjust something and then hear what the result is and then go back, make another micro adjustment. And that's sort of the place where my creativity is coming into play. I don't know exactly what thing is going to happen. And there's sort of a beauty, at least in this piece, in not knowing what thing is going to happen. But at the end of the day, I want to be able to control how everything unfolds. And that's the way that I thought I was going to put my stamp on the music.
Yeah, yeah. Wonderful. With pitch center and microtonality, I know you said earlier that you were detuning things in this piece. Is there, I kind of get not really a sense of pitch center, but not really a sense of serialism either. So I'm wondering if you achieved that via targeted means, or what you did to your pitch values exactly and what the thought process was.
So the goal, like everything else in the piece, was to try to make it inscrutable. So I didn't want people very explicitly to be able to figure out exactly what was happening.
Good job.
At a granular level, thank you. At a granular level, I'm doing a kind of trick that I often do with microtonality, and I'm actually kind of excited to get into this with you, which is to say using it as a mechanism to highlight off-ness, and then using it as a kind of temporal flag. Hey, pay attention right now because something kind of strikes your ear in a different way than it had before. So in the same way that if I were, say, a composer in the 19th century, I might reserve a note And then when that note comes in, it has kind of a special impact. I like to do the same kind of thing with microtonality. I want to reserve a particular kind of frequency that I can bring in at a moment where I want people to really pay attention.
Yeah.
And then I can subconsciously clue them in, oh, something's about to happen, something's changing. So that's one part of it. And then the other part is maybe the bigger thing, the idea of letting pitches drift in some meaningful way. So the idea of using microtonality as a way to articulate off-ness.
Yeah.
So having things in just intonation, it gets you 99% of the way to in tune, and then you can deviate from that. And I'm a big fan, and this shows up in a lot of my other music too, a big fan of asking people to play out of tune. So I might not dictate a particular number of cents, but I might say, here's a small arrow pointing up or a big arrow pointing up for, tune yourself up or tune yourself down a little bit. Sometimes if I have low enough pitches or the texture is sparse enough, I can ask people to play off by a certain number of cents so that we can kind of curate the wobbliness of the sound and the beating that happens. There was a piece I wrote for mixed nonet, I think a long time ago, called Ultradian Bipolar Disorder, where the notation was play 5 cents flat or something like that, with the idea being that it just sort of sounds a little bit grating, and then when it comes back, you feel like you're returning to a kind of a sense of stability. And that's what happens in this piece. At the most primal, disgusting, kind of guttural moments, the pitches are drifting where they're about as far apart as I can get them.
Yeah.
Before they start looping around back on themselves and just kind of sounding like they're being detuned from the other direction. But I'm doing that sort of for a particular narrative purpose because I want later, when everything comes back, not to feel a sense of pitch center returning, but to feel a sense of intonation returning.
Would you say that a sense of off-ness and the sense of instability you get from microtonality, are those always tied together, or do you sometimes tease them apart a little bit?
Yeah, gosh, it's a really interesting question. And for me, I think there are a number of ways that I can approach the problem. As you know better than anybody else, microtonality is a really wide tent.
Yes.
And there are a lot of opportunities to leverage the awesome power of microtones in ways that tell a number of different kind of stories. And I think for me, we can talk about this more later, but I think for me, really it all comes down to telling stories. And the way that I'm trying to use things and leverage things is I think about them all as tools, as tools to help me build a narrative construct. So microtonality is a tool, spectralism is a tool, counterpoint is a tool, voice leading is a tool, instruments are a tool. All of those things kind of come together to help tell the story that I want. So certainly I have often coupled them, and I think if I'm trying to make things sound really, really sloppy, which is a sound for whatever reason I particularly enjoy, then asking people to scrotatura on stage, to detune themselves, to play awkward fingerings, to pick a note that's going to sound off from your neighbor, things like that, in an aleatoric sense, I think give a kind of sensibility that does match up in the way that you said. But I also wrote a piece maybe 7 or 8 years ago called Red River Folktale for choir and tape. And I used microtonality in there, but the goal was to create a kind of even more in tune sounds. So I I'm going to say detuned, but I mean just varying it from equal temperament. So I had sort of pre-tuned everything to make it sound the way that I wanted, to make the intervals work out, to try to maximize the beauty of the story, and then just presented it to them. I notated it as if it were just traditional music, but because they're singing and they are 18, 20 cents off from the tape that's playing at the same time, they're naturally going to want to follow the tape. And so that was kind of a mechanism where I got to use microtones in a way that did split up that distinction, like you mentioned. But it also gave people kind of an easy way to access it.
Yeah.
And in that sense, I was, I guess I was kind of, I'm sure you've heard this before, but equal temperament is often like anti-lock brakes. Like, it can get you 99% of the way there, but if you're a professional race car driver, you can outbrake anti-lock brakes, right? There's a chance you're going to lock up, but you can outperform the thing that they put in your car. And it's just a safety measure to make sure that you're not going to hit a stop sign, but it's not necessarily going to keep you from, fishtailing or micro swerving or something in the car. And I think of temperament kind of in that way too. There are tricks that you can use to make the music more beautiful or more ugly or more intense, or to feel more like home, or to feel more like you're in some foreign place. And depending on the piece, I think I want to try to leverage it in different ways. So I'm not particular about the way that I'm using it, but I am kind of thinking about it as a tool and not as a world building conceit. Like it's not often at the DNA level of a piece of music of mine, which I think is interesting because so much of what I hear nowadays are people that are very purposefully exploring microtonality, but it's from the very, very first moment. And I don't have a great sense of how that happens, and maybe this is a question for you more than anything else. But I'm sort of curious how people conceptualize, or how the pre-compositional process leads you to a decision that microtonality, you're going to stick with a very specific kind of approach, and then just follow that approach throughout the entire piece. With me, it's almost always that I start purposely not thinking of it, and then I run into some situation where I say, oh, if only I had this capability, then it would make the music better. And then I sort of end up injecting it. But and maybe I'm just discovering a shortcoming of my own right now as we're talking. But I sort of wonder what it would be like to go back and really start to conceptualize an entire work with that in mind, what kind of decisions it would lead to, and how you would even begin to figure out the complicated problem of what system you're going to use and how you're going to leverage it.
Yeah, there's lots of ways to do that. I think what you've discovered is something that I like to hear microtonalists refer to as positonality, where you're just too creative for 12-tone equal temperament. So you have this situation where you would like more notes, or you would like different notes because you've thought of that idea. And so, I mean, there's lots of ways to think of these kinds of systems from the ground up, but I like situations that are like 12-tone equal temperament, where the amount of things I'm dealing with, or the notation system, or the instruments I'm using, whatever it is, reduces the act of counting itself, so that I don't have to be adding, subtracting, or anything like that. Although I don't mind a mild bit of it, if I'm like aiming for a cent value or something like that. So I like thinking about things in terms of cents, and I like equal temperament just because I think that's easy. And of course I love the sounds of just intonation. I also am just, this is like a personal thing for me. I'm just a little bit contrarian. So if I heard that somebody has explored a tuning, I'm just like, ooh, I'm going to try a different one because nobody's done that one, or whatever.
Yeah, it's sort of an undiscovered world. Not undiscovered,
discovering the tip of the iceberg, maybe.
I guess that's what it is. It's burgeoning, and it's interesting, and it feels like fertile ground for development at a time in our compositional history when we've heard so many of the sounds, right? If you jump back in time 50 years, you could write a whole piece, whole symphony about, hey, you've never heard these sounds before, and I'm gonna show them to you. I'm gonna walk you through them, and you're gonna really dig them.
Yeah.
And 100 years ago, you could maybe say the same thing about harmonic progressions or kind of verticalities in chords. I'm thinking kind of Messiaen and people like that. And, now for the true experimentalist, I think that there is a sense of, well, we can really go anywhere now And so many people for the last 100 years have been exploring what it means to be a composer and trying to push the limits. And where are the next limits going to be? Where are going to be the next things that we can push against? And so much of the microtonal stuff that I'm hearing now is just extraordinarily impressive because people are finding ways, despite having had this established system of how we're going to think about the musical world for hundreds and hundreds of years, finding ways of subverting that, that say something new and say something interesting, and really have a unique way of interacting with the world. And I think for me, at the end of the day, that's the most interesting part of this journey, is that occasionally I hear something and it's not anything I've ever thought about before.
That's really one of the big selling points about microtonality. And I also think that in 12-tone equal temperament, we do sort of hear a fairly finite amount of chords and chord progressions. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but once you're exposed to other tuning systems and the possibilities they offer, you realize that the sort of infinitude that composers desire within the choices they make, or the choices that can influence the sound of their work, you realize that microtonality should sort of like be included as well. But because of the various difficulties surrounding it, it's sort of harder to make that happen, So
my first foray into this world was very organic, but I think kind of matches the kind of feeling that you're talking about. I was in Colorado, just outside of Boulder, and I bought, or was given, it was some extraordinarily low price, a junker piano that was falling apart but sounded amazing, and it had come over to Colorado on a covered wagon, I guess.
Wow.
It was in need of great repair, and I brought it home and set it up in the front room, and just a big old 800-pound upright. And all the keys were missing. And so we painted the wood and, kind of made it fun and interesting, and had every intention of getting the thing tuned. Well, it had drifted down slightly over a semitone, and it depended on what part of the register you were playing. You would get kind of a different sort of tonality. And I started writing with that piano and ended up keeping it for 8 years and never got it tuned. I just kept letting it drift further and further.
I like this story.
And as I would try out ideas on the piano, I would try them out in all 12 keys and often in different octaves.
Ah, yeah.
And the thinking being, I was willing to admit to myself that I'm so ingrained with equal temperament that it's going to be really hard for me to math my way out of it.
Yeah.
Maybe I can discover my way out of it. So I would try the same little melodic fragment or the same ostinato in 12 different keys, maybe in 3 or 4 different octaves. And then I would pick the one that I want, record it, transcribe it, figure out how it lives, and then find some meaningful way to notate that.
Wow.
And I found that was a really nice but also kind of soft way to get into microtonality, where it didn't feel like a mathematics exercise. Again, not that there's anything wrong with that, but I was more interested in the time, and I think still am more interested in storytelling and using music as a way to investigate story and narrative flow. And I think being able to stumble on things that worked, even if I didn't fully understand why, was more helpful than trying to guess and check, which I feel like even today I would still be doing a little bit of that.
So what kinds of other directions have you given to performers to be microtonal? You mostly give directions to like play out of tune. Like what would be some examples in music where that would happen for you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So structurally, obviously there are moments of climax and destination, and there are moments where you're sort of in the journey and you're building and you're trying to arrive somewhere. And I think telling people to either play a note out of tune or suddenly become out of tune serves a couple different purposes in my music. So one, it can help push a section or a moment that's already growing into an even more frenetic kind of headspace. 2, it can also show how something has fundamentally changed. And I have, a couple pieces where I end with purposeful detunings. and don't ever go back. And so the idea is, half the ensemble is off from the other half, and usually it's because I'm trying to signify something meaningful in the narrative. The melody and the counter melody just couldn't get along, or the thing that you thought was going to happen, I want to subvert that in some meaningful way. And so asking people to be out of tune, I think in that space gives you a different outlook on what the nature of conclusion is.
Yeah.
I've had instruments also where I want them to stand out. Again, the sort of idea of a temporal flag. I want to force the listener to perk up at a very particular moment. So maybe I have a percussion instrument or piccolo if it's a large orchestral work, playing something that's microtonally disconnected from the rest of the ensemble, because whenever that thing comes in, I want it to be a signifier that something is about to happen, or that the audience needs to perk up and pay attention for some particular reason. So that can be part of it too. Letting it stand out in a particular way. And in that sense, I want to give the performer a sense of where my head's at, because I'm asking for these things for a very particular reason, right? So if I'm notating something for a piccolo player, I might fully notate it and have a number of cents up or down, and then say, purposely stand out, comma, bird call, something like that.
Right, yeah.
And it gives them a little bit of clarity, I think, in what my creative vision is for the gesture and why it's happening. One thing, I don't mean this as a criticism, but one thing that I think is interesting that happens sometimes with microtonal music is we can get so lost in the notational practice of it. It becomes hard to discern as a performer what the intent of the composer was. Is this note supposed to make things sound better if you play it right? That is to say, more in tune, more harmonious? Is it supposed to be crunchy? Are you supposed to be hearing beating somewhere? Is it supposed to sound higher than it was before? Is it supposed to sound fundamentally off or better or worse? And so anytime I'm notating this stuff, I like to be as accurate as I desire, as the piece needs, but then also I want to give them some sense of where my head's at.
And I think I got that impression from your TED Talk quite a bit. It's almost like you sort of shortened a step, which I thought was really innovative. Your little, your thing where you were talking about the wolf call, where you couldn't get the notation right, and then you drew a picture of a wolf call, and then, that's all the person needs, because now you're really telling them what you want instead of trying to fit your vision into that notation when the notation doesn't really give it to you.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. I could probably figure out some meaningful way to notate a wolf call, and I could probably communicate that. And I'm sure people, far better than me have done it in the past, and it's been successful. But really, the thing that I wanted wasn't that super precise, super perfect thing. I wanted the sound of a wolf, and it didn't particularly matter if it was a little bit longer, a little bit shorter. And yeah, the picture of the wolf really solved a lot of problems. As a former mechanical engineer, I might call it a first order engineering approximation. It feels reductive in an analytic sense, and it is, but it's also enabling. And I think part of the wolf, part of the reason why it works is that it gives them a sense of where my head's at. And then part of it is that I'm giving them permission to come up with some creative solution for my problem.
Yeah.
So I'm presenting them with an answer, but I'm also presenting them with a question. I had a solo trumpet piece for trumpet and electronics that used some microtonality. Just instead of 12 tones, it was 24. So fairly vanilla. Everything was 50 cents off. But the trumpet player removes parts of their trumpet over the course of the piece, and so sort of different combinations of finger positions will result in flub notes or ghost notes or things that just sound like air coming out. And the trumpet player doesn't really know what to expect when they first play. But I wanted to show them that was okay. That was part of the design. You kind of turn the page and turn the page, and you're playing stuff that looks very traditional musically, and eventually the notes just kind of start to get off, and they don't exactly line up with the lines, and they kind of become denser, and they kind of go up, and you turn the page, and then you're just faced with this giant picture of a monkey, kind of an angry-looking monkey that's made out of note heads, and there are no stabs, and there are no clefs. And to me, that is an indication of, one, giving a sense of what I want the thing to feel like at that moment, but then two, handing off the baton. And I'm a big proponent of giving performers freedom to make creative choices. I feel like oftentimes their choices are going to be better than mine anyway. I can get them so far, but at some point it's less productive because they are trying to do my bidding if I overnotate things, rather than undernotating and giving them some particular challenge that they can deal with or overcome. Gosh, this is the third time I'm going to bring up John Cage. I promise I won't bring him up anymore.
There's no limit.
But he has a piece called TV Köln. It's lovely, and it's one page of instructions and it's one page of score, and it's all kinds of stuff that interacts with the piano. And there's a P symbol, which I think is the piano, and there's a S, which is or an I that's inside the piano noise, and O that's an outside of the piano noise. And it's kind of a choose your own adventure, right? What sounds do you want to play at what moment? And it really becomes up to the performer to decide how they want to interact with the piece, how long they want to wait before they play a sound, what they want their relationship as a sonic curator to be, right? They're sort of in control of the piece more so than the composer. And I think that that's really clever. But the thing that John Cage did that I think is maybe double clever in TV Köln is he includes this one extra character, and I forget if it's a K or a P or an S, or it's something that he doesn't describe in the instructions. And you get 2/3 of the way down the page and you see this thing and it's like, K, what does K mean?
Oh my God.
And everything else is defined.
Oh man.
But it's defined openly. And I don't think he would get away with that if he didn't have this kind of open notational structure beforehand.
Yeah.
Right? Because he's primed the performer to engage in this particular way, by the time you get down to this thing, they're totally willing to go with him on it. And that's kind of the approach that I want to take. By the time people see the notation, by the time they actually get to the point where they're making music, they feel suitably enabled in ways that I'm curating to make their own creative decisions that are going to make the thing better.
It's interesting how much of that is dependent on the social interaction between composer and performer, and how much that really lies outside what you hear in the final result of the piece. That's just this whole other thing going on behind the scenes. But yeah. Yeah,
well, I'll tell you a funny story. I'm working on a commission right now for Third Coast Percussion, and it's called Narratology. It features a vocalist, Laurie Amat, who's an amazing singer, opera singer, improvisation specialist, but also somebody that has voiced like cartoon characters and done voiceovers for years and really kind of understands and knows her voice. So she's not part of the performance. She's a pre-recorded disembodied narrator that everybody plays along with. And the entire piece is sort of about her coming to terms with, not being a real person, and, does she count? And there's this sort of feminist metaphor going on in the background, but under the guise of this fake voice that's piped out of speakers that all the performers are playing with, but you're sort of made aware of how fake that interaction is, right? They're not doing the thing at the same time, but they sort of are, but they sort of aren't. So the reason why I bring it up is because they're playing with a click track. I don't quantize her spoken word. It's all just spoken as she would as an actress and vocalist, and then transcribed. And, I'm using kind of traditional spectralist techniques and have a whole suite of percussion instruments. But there's this moment where she's sort of growing and kind of asserting herself. And saying, I don't really want to be part of the system. I want to have a real conversation. I want to be able to say what I feel, and I can't really do that right now. And there was a great debate that we had at our last rehearsal, kind of going back and forth about the click track stopping. So there's a moment where she's kind of going into this rant and becoming, bigger and more incensed. And, how can we have a conversation if you're just repeating talking points? And how can we have a conversation if you're just spouting gibberish? And how can we have a conversation? And can we have it's this sort of big growing and growing and growing thing. And the question was, if we cut off the click track now, it's going to be a lot harder for us to figure out when exactly to come in, right? You're going to have to memorize exactly when the moment is, when some specific syllable is sounded or some particular pitch is spoken. And I was really adamant that this is, in a narrative sense, really important at that moment that we start to become unmoored from reality. So the sense that, maybe they are meant to be a little bit off. The creative decision that they're making to come in right at this moment, or to play this tom, or to play this thing that's undernotated, is significant because it's a decision that they are making. And in the narrative sense, she's talking about wanting the power to make decisions. And I think it kind of fits with taking away the click track and forcing the performers to make their own decision. And gosh, hearing them play it, you really can hear a difference.
Yeah.
And it's striking and it's strange. And it's not just, they're off a little bit. It's the look on their faces, the sweat on their brows. I don't know, the feeling in the room shifts.
Yeah.
And it goes somewhere else. And I think even if somebody were to play something exactly the same, under notation changes the attitude in the space that you're in. And it can make it more fun, and it can make it more silly, and it can make it more, in this case, about freedom and autonomy and stuff like that. But I think it really does change the attitude.
Have there ever been any performers that sort of looked at this approach and shut down instead of coming up with something?
Oh, for sure. And you have to find the right performer, somebody that's willing to embrace the weird or embrace the uncertainty at moments when it's needed. I think that there's a lot of historical baggage associated with being a composer. As you know, there's this sort of idealized version of us standing on a hilltop, like our golden locks blowing in the breeze, looking upward.
Exactly. Our personality on display in our music. All the time.
Yeah, exactly. And there's sort of like a divine inspiration. The clouds part and the melody reveals itself. And I'm just a humble composer. I'm the conduit for this melody from God to be spread to the people. And maybe it's my history as an engineer, or maybe it's just my own kind of personality. But I really see it as a mechanism of communication. I have something that I want to say to an audience, and I want to use the tools that I have at my disposal to say it. And to acknowledge that, it really becomes about that relationship, which, gosh, performers aside, I hear from composers all the time how wrong that is.
How wrong what is?
The idea of establishing a relationship with an audience. Certainly, I went to conservatory and was trained to think about music from the perspective of what pleases me and what makes me happy. And, my vision is kind of the ultimate vision. And, if an audience comes, they come. And the people that are writing music for an audience specifically are, pandering is too strong a word, but they're writing populist music, and it's pops, and it's not real art music. And how are you ever going to create a true masterpiece if you don't focus on the internal conversation? Which, boy, there's some real valid arguments to be made in that space, and I don't want to fight anybody that says this is the wrong approach. And for years, I really tried to do that, and kind of came to the conclusion that I need the interaction, and I need to think about and envision what people are going to feel when they listen to something. Because the thing that I feel is so fundamentally different from the thing that I expect somebody else would feel listening to a piece of music of mine, that I want to develop some kind of sense of critical objectivity where I can just step back and say, oh yeah, this music is great, and it works for these reasons, and it's provably beautiful, and it makes me happy, and really that's all I need. And gosh, I'm just bad at doing that. We are in kind of an interesting industry where the sort of standard operating procedure is you must look inside yourself, and anything else kind of has to get cut away because you have to service yourself first. And I don't know, I have a hard time distinguishing myself from those other people. It seems like for my work, there's a difference maybe between considering the audience in the sense of wondering if they're going to like this or if they're going to approve of my wacky decision, and if I'm going to make them feel overwhelmed effectively. Will this warm their hearts? Will this make them feel scared? Am I kind of leading them through an appropriate narrative in the way that, say, a filmmaker would be asking that same question of an audience? And gosh, is that the opposite approach to how bunch of other people make music. The sort of standard thing for a long time is, I don't want to lead you by the hand because that's reductive and it's infantilizing. I would rather just give you like a safe space to explore your own emotions, right? I want to give something that's generalizable enough, like a really obscure poetical gesture where you look at it and just the fact that it exists puts you in your own headspace and gives you some personal thing that may be different from somebody else. And gosh, there's a lot of value in that. I think there's also a lot of value in, I am feeling really overwhelmed right now, and I want you to know how I'm feeling, and I'm going to throw it all in your face and hopefully overwhelm you a little bit when you listen to this.
I've received sort of an attitude from people where maybe if you are storytelling, it's possible that the line of thinking is, well, we're not focusing on music as much, but we're kind of pulling it into something else. And I think there has been some music at conferences that does that, where if the music itself has to do with speech, I'm thinking much more about what this speech is and how that's reading. But I also feel like that's sort of fertile ground for a mixture of mediums. And it would be very interesting to sort of try and put the emotions you get from listening to speech together with the emotions you get from listening to music. And I feel like some people have done that really successfully. Two people that I think of right off the top of my head, of course, are Harry Parch. Perhaps the only person to have done it in his particular way. And I don't know if you heard Nathaniel Herring's, medical text page 57.
Yeah, beautiful.
That's a great work. I heard that and I was like, oh, that is going to get a lot of hype. And then it got that award, and he performed it at, Daniel Batt performed it at Ball State, and then I think they performed it at Seamus too. So I actually got to see it twice when it went around the conference circuit. So I was really excited about that.
Yeah, I think those are both really good examples. I think Kate Soper also kind of does really interesting work kind of in that field. The thing that you're talking about is a valid concern, and certainly one that I have for my own music, whether it's an actual problem or a perceptual problem. I see audio with talking, so therefore the composer put 50% of his my brain power into the sound and 50% into the words. And gosh, I don't have a great answer for that yet, and I'm hoping to figure out exactly what my relationship is with that. I'd like to think that I'm capable of thinking around a problem in a number of different ways, so that if it's a piece of music, but the piece of music was written by dripping paint on a canvas in some particular way, that I can be creative in how I drip, and I can be creative in the way that I transcribe, and there's something still meaningful about that communication. I don't know necessarily that I need to be entirely focused on just one thing or just the music, but at the same time, there's a really fair criticism that you could make that one who does this is abandoning the kind of theoretical precepts that got us this far. And because you're looking to experiment or to reinvent the wheel, then you're taking this totally different tack that is maybe not as high on the ladder of, what is the most art. I don't believe that there really is a ladder, but then at the same time, it kind of seems intuitively like, yeah, some art is maybe more art than other art. And it is a concern that I have. Certainly in the 21st century, we live in an environment of layers. I get done with work and I have 3 screens right up in front of me now. And I walk over one room and I turn on another screen, and my wife sits next to me. She's watching that screen. She has an iPad in her lap, and she has a phone in her hand, and is navigating all 3 of those and a conversation with me and 2 adorable cats. And it feels like that shouldn't be a thing that we're drawn to as human beings, and yet somehow it is. So while I still haven't really figured out my own relationship with transmedia narratives and multimedia performance art, I love it. I feel like it suits my personality well, and I feel like it's reflective of human beings living in America in the 21st century in a way that if I were just to sit down and compose a straight ahead string quartet, although I've done that occasionally. If I were just to sit down and do that, it wouldn't really be honest to who I am as a person.
The idea of separating how you create the music from the actual product of the music itself, or making those things sort of different, I think is a really cool idea, because there's always like this faux ignorant criticism of serial methods that isn't very related to the music you might actually hear. On my latest album that I'm dropping, all of the titles of the tracks are the tuning system. The last song I finished was in 839 times the square root of -1 equal divisions of e to the tau, where the imaginary component of the frequency is lowered 9 octaves and the constant t is stretched at any value from 0.1x to 1x. One hell of a tuning.
I love it. Well, and I mean, I love the storytelling in that too. Like, even before I listened to the thing, you've primed the pump, right? You've set me up with a certain set of expectations for what this thing is going to sound like. And now I'm really very jazzed to hear this. You know, and if you had called it, you know, experiment number 906, or whatever, there would be a very different relationship that you'd be building. Not that that's a problem, but you would be setting up a very different set of expectations. I think that's true in ways that we don't fully appreciate as composers in a general sense. And I think it's true in a whole bunch of very small, specific things, you know, from title to program notes. If you're even at the premiere, your own bearing and comportment and what you're wearing and how you speak about things, even into notational practices. I tell my students all the time that I think really there is a big difference between quarter note equals 112 and quarter note equals 112.256.
Huh.
And I don't know that the difference is necessarily in tempo, but I think the difference is the look on their face, how hard they're trying to make the thing happen. You know, you might not be able to tell a difference between an 11 tuplet in some wacky tuning system and just a scribble on a piece of paper that says, you know, rising, ascending line, fake it. But the performer knows. And it leaches out into their face. And you see that because we're interacting with audiences directly. You can see a performer struggling to count, trying really hard. You can see when they're relaxed. You can see when they're fraught. You can see when they're deep in it, and you can see kind of when they pull back. And I think the same thing is true for composers, but just with one more level of removal from the process.
Yeah. All of that really is tied so much into the impressions you get from something, just like first impressions and the psychology that has on you. And I think that the things that you're bringing up about stress and whether the performer is stressed or not, that is a really interesting issue, because I think that's sort of the main complaint against the new complexity movement, right? Is that you're sort of intentionally stressing out the performers in a sense, or at least I've heard some performers complain about new complexity for that very reason, and that's something that I wouldn't want to do to people who are getting into microtonality. It goes back to what you said about 112 BPM versus 112.257. There's a lot of people, I think, that just instinctively react negatively to anything they perceive as overly complicated. Whereas I'm sort of a different person. I've learned to sort of separate that conception, realize that I make mistakes, and the things that I do mathematically are approximations of whatever's going on in the real world. But a lot of people, I don't think, have that part of them, or they don't care to make that a part of them.
Or maybe something gets lost in translation too. You know, as you're delivering a document to somebody and a set of instructions, and then they're delivering a render of that document to somebody else. And at any step in that process, there's room for somebody to not really understand what you mean and to feel something and to have it come out. So I think if we're talking new complexity, that's maybe a different ball of wax, not to back up the truck too far. But when we talk about what is virtuosity in the 20th century and certainly in the 21st century, there are big philosophical and even ethical considerations. You know, if you're an EDM artist, is it virtuosic if you just stand on stage and dance around and press play? But if the music is really cool, is that cool? But then did you have to write the music for it to be virtuosic? But is it not? Because virtuosity really isn't a compositional practice. It's more performative. And what are you performing? But what if you juggled on stage when you press play? Is that virtuosic? I don't have an answer, but I can say with new complexity, there is something kind of meaningful to seeing a group of people trying something that's really, really hard.
Yeah.
And looking on stage like it's really, really hard.
Yeah, that's exciting, I have to say. I guess with microtonality, I know that people seeing 112 point whatever, you know, won't like that as much as 112. So I want to be in a situation where if I present microtonality to people, I try and hide the numbers for most people, and then for the people who are interested, I can say, here you go, here's some cool information. I think a lot of people, myself included, are really terrified at musically illiterate people just calling their music random because they don't understand it immediately. And, you know, it's not a sin to be random, right? But you don't want, at least I don't want, this people getting this sense of, oh, he just doesn't care about his creations, and so he made it all random. Because it's certainly possible to do that, but I know that I don't do that, and most composers I know don't do that. I don't think I know very many composers who use randomness as an excuse to put in less work. In fact, it's often the other way around, but that's what people don't know.
Right, yeah. How deep is too deep? What are your expectations of the audience? How much do you anticipate that they will actually pick up from this, and how much of it is... hand waving is a little bit dark, but how much of it is hand wavy? One thing that I really like about what you're saying is that it seems like in both situations you're acting as an advocate for microtonality. And in one sense, it's like, let me prove to you just how precise and lovely and musical I can make these decisions. And it happens to require this notational practice, but I'm going to be very soft and delicate. So when a performer sees it, they say, oh, he really wants me to find success here. And they fall in love with it, and they play more microtonal music, and they live a happy life. And then on this other side, it's like, oh, look how complicated that this can seem. But by pulling the rug out from under it, you're telling the story of, oh, but it's actually kind of all in fun, and it's actually like, it's still making music, and making music is fundamentally a fun, silly, engaging, lovely activity. And even in that way, you're still advocating for people to become more interested in microtonality. So no matter which approach you take, it's still like, at the end of the day, you're transmitting the same message, which is, hey, this thing is cool and it's valid and it's worth exploring. And guess what? I think your excellent podcast does the same thing.
Working on it.
So I wonder if maybe somewhere like deep down, you know, at the heart of who you are as a composer and as a creative, if you're thinking of yourself as an advocate.
Because microtonality doesn't get the attention that it deserves, and I feel like I can advocate for it properly in any context, I feel like I have a duty to do that. And so I should continue doing that. That's how I feel, just like as a human being, I guess.
That's a really lovely attitude. And, you know, I think it permeates your work, and it, you know, permeates the way that you choose to curate your life. And I think that's great. I mean, you're living the music that you're making, and there's something really meaningful about that.
Well, thanks. Yeah.
You know, so many people search for years and years and years to try to figure out what is the thing that they have to say to the world. And few make it that far. It's a hard thing, you know, to really know. And especially in a time when there are more composers than ever, the process of composition has become democratized to the point where all you need is a laptop, and just for free, you get the tools that you need to win a Grammy. I'm talking popular music, but certainly, you know, the tools that you need to launch a career of pre-recorded music or fixed media or music concrete. In that space, how do we as creative philosophers and kind of deep thinkers in a creative space carve out room for us to figure out what it is that we have to say? And it's kind of the eternal question. And it's clear that you've thought a great deal about it. You have a lot of different ways of attacking the problem, but it all kind of comes back to the same core principles, the set of principles. I think that's really what makes musical masterpieces work so well too.
Yeah.
Any way you want to think about them, any way that you want to attack the piece, you come back to this same core fundamental principle. And that's kind of the thing that I want my music to do. Any way that you want to look at it, you want to talk about note choice or process or extra musical implications or narrative or text or microtonality or pitch selection or spectralism or whatever. I want all those things to sort of wrap back around themselves and leave you with the thing, whatever that thing is, some core nugget of an idea that I'm trying to transmit. And if I can transmit it in parallel across all those different planes of musical existence, then I think I've done my job. And that's also the kind of music that I'm really attracted to as well. People that can think about the way that they're storytelling on a number of different levels, and where every level is consistent and every level is cohesive.
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely sort of a magic in in that experience when everything unites together and you have something about the piece that you can't get from any other piece that's also special, not just because it's unique, but also because it is itself.
Yeah, and that's sort of the dream, right?
Yeah, because I think it's really hard to be unique without telling a story, honestly. There's a part of me that is like, I should be unique because being unique is a cool thing. But as a philosophical person, since I understand that everything is kind of a matter of degree, I'm also a bit tempted to kind of say, well, really, nothing's unique, technically, which is fine. And then you kind of give up that whole game, and then instead of necessarily focusing on being unique, you can focus on making something good. And being good and unique are things that are wrapped up in each other for me.
Like there's a very real problem, opportunity, I don't know what to call it, in the world. There's a real something in the world where we've conflated the creative act of making music and of making art with the profession of making music and making art. And often being unique means commissions and means promotions and, you know, writing an article in a way that's just slightly more verbose than it needs to be leads people to read it and think that you know slightly more than you do. And maybe that looks good for a tenure committee. And maybe that's how you can sell your next project. And maybe that gets you an in with somebody else. And
right.
Gosh, all those things. I can't fault anybody for playing that game.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's challenging to make a living and to find happiness as a musician in the world. And certainly as a composer, and certainly as a composer of cutting edge, new experimental orchestral music or electroacoustic music, that's a real challenge and kind of a tough thing for people to navigate. So on one hand, I don't really want to fight to try to be unique anymore. On the other hand, there may be something lodged deeply in all of us that struggle for uniqueness. I mean, there's a reason we as a society are flattening out the bell curve for child names, right? We're giving people more unique names and fewer, more standard names. And maybe some of that is just the infrastructure that's developed around us, internet searchability, Facebook, Twitter, the struggle for uniqueness. I think that's all real there. But certainly, in my music, I feel like that was something that I struggled with for a long time and felt like I dealt with. There was sort of a moment in school and you're writing music and you figure out who you want to be and you try a thing and you're bad at it and you try something else and you're okay at it and you try to grow and you try to learn. And, for me, I don't know that any of those technical things really impacted who I am and what kind of creative statement I have to say to the world more than just figuring out who I was as a person, growing up and becoming an adult and living in the world and developing opinions about things and feeling like I have enough authority over my own body and my own narrative to think that I have something meaningful to say.
We talked about how you used visuals and Maximus P together for Venom consumption and saturation, even though the visuals were a tool for you to use and not really like part of what you presented to the public about that piece. Can you talk a little bit about how you used visuals in LEDpaint? I'd be really fascinated to hear what you did for those.
One thing that I like to do when I start working on a piece of music before I start the pre-compositional process is a thing that I call the meta pre-compositional process. So I create an approach for how I'm going to approach the piece. And
Whoa.
It sort of comes down to what sorts of things do I need to generate, what kinds of thoughts do I need to think about, what process do I need to go through, and then be assured at the end of that process I'm going to come up with a plan that's reasonable.
I've just been calling that pre-composition.
Oh, that's so interesting. So I very much think about it in two distinct phases.
Huh.
I want to make sure that I write my melodies when I've had a bunch of sugar, because it's going to affect me in a particular. I'm being a little bit silly, but I want to make sure that I separate out that step at the beginning, so then I'm setting myself up for as much success as possible when I go into the actual pre-compositional creative process. Because even there, I could be asking myself, do I really want to be having sugar, or maybe it's better if I do it right when I get up in the morning. Maybe it's better if I have a fan on. Maybe it's better if I write in piano reduction. Maybe it's better if I write in equal temperament first and then spin it out after that, right? All those questions are things that could be resolved earlier, and so I like to separate it out a little bit. So LEDpaint was a project for photography and audio capture. There's a compositional element in the sense that I am telling performers what to do. Some of that is improvisatory. I'm in the room with them. But I think of the project as a kind of documentary practice. And it's a practice that was really interested in what shapes performers and sound makers make. So the conceit at the very beginning of the process was, I want to take a long exposure shot of something. That something will be sonic in nature, musical most often. I want to take it in a dark room, and I want to have it lit up by little LED lights that I've put on people's bows or legs or fingers or harps or drums or whatever. And we had a bunch of dancers come in, a bunch of musicians in pitch dark rooms, and take these long exposure shots, 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes, of people individually, in small groups or large groups, making noise. And as they make the noise, the shutter is open. So that was my conceit. I want to set up everything before I compose it, right? Before I take the picture, run through the process. So I would have sheet music, and people would memorize it, and we would say, oh, try this and do this differently, and what if it was this way? But the goal was to try to line up the angelic quality of a harp with the angelic look of people's hands kind of drifting up and down in a harp shape.
Right.
That kind of relationship I thought was really profound. And I wanted to strip out everything else that wasn't that. So there's no setting, there's no character, there's no plot, there's no real musical development. It's a kind of series of snapshots, and each snapshot is a representation of a particular musical gesture that is then captured or graphed, if you want to use a mathematical term, on this photograph. Each one of them has kind of an action verb associated with it as the title. And then the sort of creative conceit that I found had a lot of play was I printed these things out and then made little title placards. And each title placard had a little photoresistor in it that was connected to an Arduino, and then the Arduino is connected to a computer. And I had all of these sounds queued up ready to go. And depending on the situation, I would hang between 4 and 60 of them in a space, turn on all the lights, have a little sign out front that says, turn your phone on to see the art or whatever it said. People would turn on their phone flashlight, walk in, and then illuminate various pieces. You print it on paper with metallic pigments in it, so the light gets reflected off the metallic pigments. As you shine the light on it, it engages the photoresistor, and it plays the sound that was associated with the light.
Oh.
So again, it's sort of trying to bring people into this space. I didn't want them to feel like they had missed out on the party, right? Oh, the performance already happened, and here's a picture of it. I wanted them to feel like they were actively engaged in the process of making the sound. So I do a little bit of detuning and a little bit of playback variation depending on where the flashlight is. But essentially, I want people walking around this room, shining a light on the things. The things themselves are light. They're making sounds as they move around. And then as they expose this image, they're also exposing the sound that accompanies it.
Then is that where the SoundCloud sort of like piece or sample comes from, with like Bow and Jam in particular, or are those just two of them?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so those are two examples. So Jam was a work that we shot in the Tank Center for Sonic Arts. It's kind of right on the Colorado-Utah border. It's a big, giant water tank that never really was used as a water tank, but it's reverberant and echoey and amazing.
Yes.
So we turned off all the lights, and it was at night, put LEDs on performers, and just had them move around the space, improvising, and captured that sound. And then when we're talking about Bow, you said was the other one?
Yeah, it was the other one you sent me, and wow, beautiful.
So that was a collection of string players then that were playing together, and you can see kind of the sawing back and forth as people are playing these really clustery, dense chords. But the sound that you're hearing that's associated with it is exactly and only the sound that was present when the shutter was open.
Wow. That's just so neat.
So if you really are careful and want to play at home, you can even track, the organist moved her foot at this particular time, and you can see the movement and hear it. Or there's one where I took a shot on horseback with 4 horses on a hill, walking, trotting, cantering, and galloping. And you can see the pattern in I think it's ride is the name of that movement. But you can see the pattern.
Oh, let me see if I can find it. Oh, is it trot?
I think trot was probably just trotting.
Oh, I found it. It is ride.
There are a bunch of them, and I don't exactly remember the names years later. So if you look at that one, it's sort of it's enticing to me because it kind of looks like a mathematical graph of movement, like the sort of old zoetrope kinds of visualizations of horse movement. But I wanted to capture that and then also capture the sound so you can hear when you listen to it things that you can't get from when you see it. Are they moving left to right to left? Who's going first? Who is faster? How are they, all that is kind of revealed when you listen to the sound. And I think that the same thing is true among some of the other examples, but certainly the intent was to try to capture the shape of a sound in some meaningful way.
You get this quasi-periodic sense from rides since they're moving in one direction. It's kind of like an artful version of, sinusoids a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's well put. The idea that, we produce periodic patterns in our sound making practice, but we also produce periodic geometric patterns in the way that we move.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to sort of represent that. The combination of visual and sonic, I think, is maybe more closely related than we sometimes admit to ourselves.
Oh, it's very close. Yeah. Wow. This definitely reveals a lot about how people move, and you've also created some really breathtaking images as well.
Oh, well, thank you.
I really like this one strike that's all gold, and it also has some red, and this is the piano. So does this have to do with how the hammers have moved?
Yeah, so it's LEDs on the fingers, and I believe you're peering inside the piano.
Yes, that's what it looks like.
So this one, basically, it's me. I'm the performer in this piece. I have lights, 2 lights on my left hand and 2 lights on my right hand, and I'm just pounding on the inside of a piano. So the sound that you hear is meant to be kind of explosive and volcanic. I don't know how the pink got in there. I might have had a pink on my head, but maybe my head was out of frame. But if you look at the image itself, you can see that it kind of gives you that same explosive energy that hopefully the sound conveys. There are a few other piano-specific ones in there that I think are interesting and maybe meaningful. Invert is one of them that works kind of outside the piano. And then, let's see, there's one more.
Oh yes, this was one of my favorite images where you've got the LED lights and blue might be the right hand and yellow might be the left hand.
Yeah, that's right. And then, obviously the recording itself, I'm playing a kind of inverted melody. The theme itself is the low marmé tune, which we probably don't have enough time to get into, but I'm taking the original melody and doubling it in fifths and octaves in the right hand, doing the same in the left hand, but then inverting my left hand. So if I go up in the right, I go down in the left. So you sort of see this thing that slides up and down around the F, which is it's kind of visualized in the middle of the piece. So yeah, I'm just kind of crouched in front of the piano, playing the thing. You can see the reflections off of the backstop, whatever you call it, the piece of the piano that's reflected that's behind the keyboard. But the idea behind the low marmé complex that I really liked is that we're not really sure what it means. The armed man, we all must be the armed man must be feared, and we all must take up arms against the armed man. And it's on one hand, it's sort of this cry for battle, and then on the other hand, it's maybe it's doubted, maybe it's not feared. Maybe there's some kind of, in the same way that like maybe Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet was more of a farce than we sort of pretend like it is. That maybe the Low Marmé complex was a little bit more like, I don't really know that these people are so great, but I'm going to say how great they are and how powerful. And there's a lot of baggage, I think, associated with a particular melody, but I wanted to maybe showcase that duality, the sense that there's something inversionally or reflectively meaningful about the melody itself and the thing that the melody represents. We're not really sure if it's a serious thing or if it's not. It's a dual kind of presentation now, and it certainly gets used in a number of different ways in the past. So that was what I was trying to capture there.
What a fantastic way to demonstrate inversion in the real world. I feel like this is something that I can show people who don't know anything about music. See how the light pattern, it reflects over. It's the same in the middle. Very like visually oriented.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, gosh, I appreciate that. Well, yeah, feel free to check the rest of them out. I have other work online, and certainly drop me a line. And to any of your listeners as well, I'm always happy to talk philosophy or about my music, or if there are any questions or concerns. I'm sure I said a few things on here that ruffled some feathers, but they, everything I said feels true to me, and I think is reflective of the way that I work and that I interact with my own creative oeuvre. So I certainly welcome opinions and voices to the contrary. In the same way that microtonality is a wide tent, I think modern music making is a wide tent. And there's room for an awful lot of different approaches. And that's certainly one of the most fun things that I do during my day, is just finding time to sit down and discover new folks and listen to new music and try to imagine myself in their world and try to imagine the thought process and the way that they interact with the people around them and the way that they live their life and how that is represented in a piece of music, art as a kind of porthole to our own internal and deeply unique humanity.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for being on. Be sure to look out for Hunter's piece with Third Coast Percussion. What is it called? Narratology?
Narratology. Yeah, this is the first time in public that I've said it, so now I have to stick with it.
All right. Well, thanks so much. I think we got a great episode, and we'd love to have you on the show again.
Yeah, that'd be great. I have a bunch more questions for you, too. A lot of stuff that I'd want to get into, and I'm happy to come back. I was happy to be here today. Thank you so much for having me. This was an awful lot of fun.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for listening, everybody. The piece you heard just now was Hunger Dreams in Flux by Hunter Ewen. If you haven't checked out the social media links and stuff below, you really need to look at that. Hunter's website about LEDpaint is just amazing. That's the one that we were talking about earlier. You'll see all these gorgeous, vivid pictures that have the accompanying music that we were describing. So you definitely need to check that out and look at all of the other stuff on his website because it is amazing. Just a couple of general reminders and things like that. We were featured on the Top 10 Music Theory podcasts post in FeedSpots, so we have a link to that in the description if you want to check out some of those other podcasts. We're really, really honored to be featured in that. And we also have a Patreon account, so if you want to donate to us to help keep this podcast going, that would be really, really appreciated, especially in this time of quarantine where income is very, very not easy for artists such as myself. I'm also going to be trying to make some music and sort of maybe use Patreon to make that exciting. So for real Now and Zen fans who are Zen harmonic gods, you will all probably get sneak peeks of things that I am doing that are insanely exciting that nobody else will get peeks to. So there's also that. I'd just like to thank all my patrons because I think they're all just so great and so helpful, and you guys are amazing. We hit the 20 patrons mark this month, which is super exciting. And when we hit 150, basically that makes up for the job that I quit to do Now and Zen, essentially. So that's what I am trying to accomplish. This show was not possible without the help of our patrons, our Zen harmonic patrons, as well as our Zen harmonic gods, Kit Duguay, Hector McGuffin, Joshua Sanchez, Christopher Bailey, Leland O. Weigel, Amy Coleman, Jill Weigel, Tina Harmon Carteau, and the Brass Whisperer. Thank you so much for all you do and for listening to the show. We'll see you next time. In April, we plan to have on Craig Grady and James Mulvale, and our bonus episode in March, which you can view if you're a patron, is going to be playing around with synths, both Vito Cicarella's Super Virtual Keyboard and a few other ones that accept scale files, so be sure to listen to that. Okay, see you next time.